Before we get into today's show, I'd like to take a moment to invite you to share your thoughts and opinions on our work. If you have feedback, ideas, or suggestions regarding any part of our overall platform, we'd love to hear from you. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We're listening. Your insights help us to grow and ensure that we're making the greatest impact possible. To share your thoughts, go to insightmyanmar.org/feedback. For this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast, we're happy to have on Gerard McCarthy, who is the Assistant Professor of Social Policy and Development at the International Institute of Social Studies, ISS, in The Hague, where we are now speaking in your office. Thank you so much for being available and having this forthcoming conversation.
Good to be with you.
So we're going to be talking extensively about your 2023 book, Outsourcing the Polity, Non-State Welfare, Inequity and Resistance in Myanmar, which we really encourage listeners to go into if some of the topics from this conversation piques their interest, which I really think it will. As we do with many of our guests, before we get to your book, it's always nice to know a bit of the background of the guest as well as where they kind of started to come into the Myanmar orbit and what led to the work that we'll be discussing.
Yeah. Good to be here, and thank you for making the time. I sort of came into Myanmar from interest in sort of conflict and political settlement comparatively. So I was working in South Sudan a better part of 15 years ago, and had sort of an ongoing kind of interest in Myanmar, and then the 2010 election happened, and it was sort of became this sort of puzzle of like, what's happening? Like, what is this dynamic that is, unfolding? And my kind of focus at the time was thinking about how societies that have very long histories of conflict and deep, developmental and kind of poverty crises, how do they kind of emerge in more positive ways and find kind of political settlements that can, try and be a bit more economically and politically inclusive. And so I found Myanmar a really interesting case study, and then over time sort of did a couple of visits and sort of increasingly lengthy sort of study visits, kind of visiting different parts of the country and starting to get a better sense about, at the time I was beginning to think about whether I might want to do a PhD at some point, and sort of had kind of this aspiration that if I was going to do a PhD, I really wanted to be in a context that was politically and economically and socially dynamic during that period of what in the kind of political science literature is referred to as sort of a critical juncture or a political transition. And so Myanmar kind of fit that category at the time, and I sort of, basically became an interesting context in which to explore a bunch of these questions in, kind of the real kind of fabric of people's lives. And as I got to kind of spend more and more time there in the early 2010s, that became more and more possible to say, okay, I actually can see that there are entry points into interesting organizations that are sort of trying to find ways to do social work or do political action in this still very kind of early days of the insane kind of period, that was my kind of entry point. And then from that, my PhD ended up focusing on the sort of centre of the country, partly because kind of in-depth political studies at a local and provincial level in Myanmar, basically there's this huge gap in understanding about what happened outside of Yangon and Mandalay, to a lesser degree, basically between the 62 coup and the early 2010s, because the nature of visas and how researchers got access was very fragmentary and mediated, and so I kind of, after spending quite a lot of time outside Yangon those early 2010s years, sort of thought we just don't really know how society has changed and how it is changing. And this is a particularly interesting time in which to explore some of those questions. And so that was sort of what my entry point was, to try and contribute to an understanding about where and how society has evolved since the collapse of socialism, and then the legacies for how democracy was being practiced in the 2010s, and then increasingly becoming puzzled about why poverty wasn't really a major agenda item in terms of social policy and social protection, even amongst avowed kind of Democrats, and sort of trying to think about and not about, why are people thinking about democracy in this way that is, not necessarily inclusive of the poor, and how do we get there? And so that was my sort of entry point, and I spent a couple of years in northern Bago region and northern Karen State as part of my PhD fieldwork, and that's kind of unfolded into what is now the book and ongoing kind of research after the coup as well.
So then, as I understand it, you were not just looking in the transition period as to what was shaping up, and not just in the urban areas, but also outside in some of the regions that aren't quite so studied. But then you were also looking historically at what had come before, leading into what was then starting to unfold.
Yeah, I mean, sort of there's a classic. A lot of the, Myanmar, Burma is a fascinating context from a political anthropology perspective. Some of the most seminal studies of ethnicity, of political authority, of village life and rural politics come from Burma. But basically, fieldwork kind of ended for people after the '62 coup. And so, you kind of look at this kind of archive of, a lot of the interesting conceptual development about ethnicity being quite fluid, actually. And that was quite a transformational contribution to how we understand identity and ethnicity and even religion, and how it was kind of practiced in the everyday nature of life, moving beyond these sort of theoretical approaches to saying, like, well, how do people actually live it? And so there was this fascinating research done in really the 50s. And then, because of the nature of fieldwork, it was, there were a few examples here and there, and I try to engage with as much of that literature as possible in my book and in my research. There are a few Japanese scholars who managed to spend kind of lengthy periods in and out of rural areas and provincial areas in the 90s, for example. And there are, of course, Burmese scholars who kept low profiles, but again, sustained ongoing kind of connection to provincial and village contexts in the 1990s and 2000s. But they're in some ways the exception rather than the rule. And so I kind of, I was kind of trying to situate, how do we find ourselves now in the 2010s, and with this sort of, the fever pitch of hope and aspiration in those early 2010s and mid-2010s period, and especially the, high level mark probably at the end of 2015 with the NLD's election of, like, Myanmar's transformed, or is it transforming? What is it becoming? And trying to kind of think about, well, how does the historical context of provincial authority, politics, state business relations, that we kind of have missed in many ways, because there just wasn't anyone following these dynamics. That how do we actually build up an understanding of quote unquote national politics by actually looking at a bit more of a lived experience about society, the economy, and kind of politics, and all of those things interconnecting with religion and how it's lived. So that was my sort of approach, and sort of the historical as well as the kind of forward-looking about what's possible in this context where you've inherited all this sociology. What is actually the possibility for democracy to deliver on some kind of a promise of economic and social inclusion in a meaningful way, and so that was my sort of starting point. And then, of course, we find ourselves in a very different context now post-coup than those heady days of the 2010s. But a lot of the dynamics, I argue, that we see now, we actually local resistance groups being supported by villagers, and in this really kind of quite inspiring dynamics of reciprocity at a village level. I argue that these kind of dynamics and the ideas that underpin them of solidarity, of social obligation, they don't come from nowhere. And then we have to uncover them, and it's not even just in Buddhist kind of theory, right? Buddhism as it's practiced and lived varies greatly according to different contexts, and one of the arguments I make in the book is about how understandings even of Buddhist charity and the limits of that changed a lot in the 1990s and 2000s because of the nature of how society changed and how the economy changed. And so, I argue that there's a historical dimension that we need to look at in order to understand both where we are now, but also what's possible in this context. And I think that's more true now after the coup than ever before.
That's so fascinating. There's so many threads in there I want to pull from. Before pulling on those, I just want to comment that I'm especially interested in those discussions where I find that some of the misconceptions that come about Myanmar is when people are taking those touchstone moments of the big events happening and trying to just analyze what that's about without all of the background that goes into it. And that's where, and I've referenced this so many times on this podcast, but that's where I keep calling attention to, for example, the works of Elliot Prase Freeman and Delphine Schrank, who both in their writing talked about kind of those when no one was paying attention, when nothing seemed to be happening, to be able to understand what was actually occurring in those spaces, which then led to the big events happening. And to quote what you just said, they don't come from nowhere. These things don't come from nowhere. They when you don't have that patience and understanding of looking at the background and the buildup, then it could just seem like, oh, saffron suddenly happened, or oh, 88 they did this, or oh, look at all these resistance groups are doing this. But that's obviously a very superficial way of looking at it, and a bit also in not having the patience and the diligence and looking at what the structural societies and conditions that allowed these things to happen as they did. Again, they didn't come from nowhere. And so that's where I'd like to start this discussion off, is going into the fact that you studied this historical period, which is really a bit of a dark age of how little literature was coming out and how inaccessible it was, and looking at some of the things you mentioned. I mean, obviously the prevalence and the influence of Buddhism and the different types of Buddhism, the relation between the state and the people, these ideas of the reciprocal nature of relations, of welfare and generosity and how it was practiced. All of these themes that you come out, I'm incredibly fascinated by them, and seeing how they've played out today, and what your understanding has been historically of what you saw in the society leading up to that.
Yeah, I think these are the kind of core questions, and it is, I think you get a lot of tropes in discussions about Myanmar, and even research about Myanmar. You kind of get these recurring narratives that, that kind of flatten the complexity in sometimes theoretically helpful ways, and in ways that you sort of simplify matters so it's easier to make general rules of thumb. But also that you just can lose so much in that process. And sometimes there's ideological reasons for that you sort of want to play down some aspects and play up other aspects. But one of the things, and this is sort of a personal kind of commitment of mine, that you see even kind of Burmese folks who are researchers who've lived through some of these transitions are influenced by the flattening of narratives. So one of the ones which I think is super problematic is this notion of like, basically the military's been in charge since 1962 through till 2010, and there wasn't really much change and evolution in the nature of military rule. And this is one, I mean, you know, like as an academic, I review papers, and you know, it's a narrative that you get even from Burmese authors, where you're like, you have either lived through this or relatives that you know have lived through this, and you know that there was, you know, like that the way that they kind of feel like the narrative exists in the international space. Is that they kind of need to flatten those complexities. And so one of the things that I look a lot at is market reform. And so how the change from kind of state kind of concentration of wealth through that kind of socialist period evolved after the collapse of socialism in '88. And there's a big debate about how socialist the socialist period was, but there's absolutely no debate about the fact that the concentration of wealth in the hands of the state changed significantly. Mediated through the state and through the military, but there was an emergent business class that emerged through the 1990s and 2000s, connected to, you know, military patronage networks and this quid pro quo dynamic, but also you know, there were kind of ideological dimensions to that, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, that actually in the 1990s it's not as if socialism just disappeared. There was a dynamic of people who used to be BSPP or Burma Socialist Program Party, which is the one-party state under Ne Win. There were, you know, people who ran, you know, the industrial strategy for the socialist regime, who all of a sudden were told, you need to marketize. You need to kind of start to encourage business people to take on some of these responsibilities, because maybe they'll do a better job. And that in this process of sort of beginning to sell off state assets or give people licenses, there were all sorts of things that went on. A lot of it was, you know, cronyism and patronage. You know, give, you know, contracts to the, you know, brother of the general or whatever, and, you know, everyone gets wealthy. But one of the things that, again, gets a bit lost is sometimes the ideological dimensions of this. And there was actually a huge amount of kind of tension in that BSPP kind of shadow period in the early 90s about like laying people off, like shuttering factories and selling state assets off to you know, cronies, knowing that people are going to lose their jobs. And this was a huge tension, actually, that needed to be offset and balanced somehow ideologically. And you know, there's literature about this from Burmese colleagues. Tim Martin, my former colleague from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, has written about this sort of early industrialization strategy in the early 1990s. And the tensions around it. But you see these kind of interesting dynamics where actually socialism just doesn't evaporate, right? And again, there's big debates about whether socialism ever really delivered, but there was a discourse about trying to support the vulnerable, and then all of a sudden the state gives up this commitment that you know, basically came from the colonial period, where, you know, the peasantry was so exploited by the colonial economy and by British rule that the independence movement was deeply socialist and basically deeply communist. And so, as a result, those 50s and then the post, you know, the kind of post-independence period became defined by these questions of like, how do you drive development whilst not leaving the poor behind, and how do you interact with capitalism? And so this was a key tension of the 50s, and actually, like, ideologically, the military really justified that 1962 coup discursively around. Oh yeah, basically the UNU government abandoned socialism. They've left socialism behind. They've failed to implement socialism as we need it. And so that's why we are going to take control. And that kind of, the kind of socialist discourse has really been lost in a lot of the literature about, especially in conflict, for instance, in Myanmar, and then gets repeated in academic literature, including by Burmese scholars sometimes who are engaging with that literature, and so it becomes about chaos and anarchy, and the ideological dimensions don't really come into play. And so what I kind of tried to do through my work was actually like, look at what did change in the 1990s and 2000s, and you do see this emergence of this business class at a local provincial level after 88, of people who, previously came from kind of very, very kind of low middle class backgrounds, maybe university students, who then all of a sudden realize that there's money to be made in this post-socialist kind of period, form these relationships at a very local level with local military commanders, and then work their way up, build empires, business by business, getting government contracts, but also engaging in sort of this post-socialist ethic is what I kind of would think of it as. It's like, you can't be wealthy in a really poor context without giving some of it away. Mm-hmm. And this was an ideology actually which was encouraged in the early 90s by the USDP, the Union Solidarity Development Party, or Chiang Kai-shek, the party, or the USDA. It was a veterans association which then became the political party. But they ran workshops at a local level, and Gustav Hauptmann has written a lot about this in the 1990s, this sort of, if you are a capitalist, if you are engaging in business, you need to be taking responsibility for the community in which you're operating. And that actually, these trainings and these books, they're fascinating. They're actually a real relic of a particular ideological moment in time, where basically they say, the booklets say, the best time in Burmese history was when business people would take responsibility for building roads and bridges and schools and gifting them to the monarch. And this was sort of this fascinating historical rereading of how things operated, and this framing of like business people as sort of, I suppose, being traders and people engaging in kind of colonial era or pre-colonial era trade and economic activity. But this was very much a reimagining about what the responsibility of the individual was in a post-socialist context. And so what I tried to do in the book and in my project was to kind of unfold, there was this ideological shift where it was, the state was previously responsible for delivering development and trying to address inequality. Post-socialism, the state's gone the state has gone bankrupt. The administrative apparatus of the state is sort of functionally has lost all faith, and as a result, we need to engage in market reform, but do it in a way that shifts responsibility over to private actors, but also non-state actors. And this is where I think there's this political economy question, that a lot of the histories and again these stories about how civil society came about, that we know is incredibly vibrant, has these hundreds of thousands of organisations that are from the village level building all the way up to a national level, that anyone who spends more than 10 minutes kind of engaging in local social issues in Myanmar will realise that there's lots of organisations with lots of different opinions and thoughts, and actually they were encouraged to develop in the 1990s and 2000s as long as they operated within quite specific boundaries. Yeah. And that often when you look back, and this is something I did in my research, who were the founding members of these organisations? It was often these business people who had begun to accrue some level of private capital, either by engaging with the military and military patrons, or by just kind of navigating in a sort of strategic way this sort of post-socialist period, that the economy did grow. There was market, rapid private capital which began to grow in the 1990s and 2000s. But with that came an ethical question for what do people do who have some resources, and how do they balance that with their local relationships with people who know that they're far wealthier than anyone else, and a military context that said the state doesn't do social provisioning anymore. It's up to the business people, it's up to the society to do that. And that was actually something at a local level that was encouraged, And initially it was government organised kind of community organisations around ambulances and funeral parlours, funeral services, free funeral service. And then from those kind of emergent models where basically business people, often the chairmans of the township, rice association, rice traders association, and the military, heads of the military installations in that context, heads of the military bases, would come together with monks. And you walk into some of these organisations that were founded in the early 90s, and they were like the signboards, and it's like this hierarchy of like who was the most important in the 1990s and 2000s. And then these government organised kind of, or semi kind of government organised community-based organisations prove the model that it's possible to actually do some kind of social action during autocratic rule if you navigate it in a particular kind of way. And that provided a social space for people to begin to engage in social activity of a kind of charitable nature. And monks began to realise that there was actually space for lay people to do this kind of activity. And so you kind of begin to have this political economy where there's more private capital to fund these kinds of activities. And you'll then have an ideological kind of, theological kind of shift where the idea of work for others, or parahita in Burmese, or in Pali, that this concept expands massively in the early 1990s. And you look back at the kind of history of parahita, and Alicia Turner's written about the kind of colonial period and the kind of idea of work for Buddhism, that the examples that she gives and that the colonial period kind of envisaged was really about the propagation of Buddhism. Right? It was about teaching Buddhism to young kids. It was about Dharma classes, or in an extreme kind of, or not extreme, but in a kind of on the kind of edge of the platform was like sweeping the pagoda. Like that was a form of work for others because you're cleaning up for people to be able to enjoy and participate in Buddhist practice. And cut to by the mid 1990s, the idea of parahita begins to become increasingly used in relation to charitable work for supporting the elderly, or the ambulance service, or the free funeral service, or the blood bank, or increasingly road construction, that sometimes were mediated through monks and monastic institutions, which had a really important role in this kind of ecosystem. But there was an ideological shift in how, and a kind of theological shift actually, in what I would say is the bounds of Buddhist social work, that it used to be a lot more narrow around like basically propagating Buddhism, to then saying actually the state is withdrawn, the state is absent, we need to fill the gap. And as good ethical people, or people trying to be good ethically in this vexed ethical, conundrum of autocracy as it was in the 1990s and 2000s, which is similar to today, how do people try and be good in this kind of context, right? And so that I think provides there's a political economy dynamic where there's more private capital, but it's also this kind of ethical question that then I argue develops into the proliferation of these local organisations that try to address, public goods problems in the post-socialist period. And this isn't unique to Myanmar. There are other countries, Vietnam is another, and plenty of other kind of post-socialist contexts where the state is withdrawn. This kind of question about who takes up social responsibility after the end of this kind of all-encompassing promise of a state that tries to control the economy and then try to provide welfare and does it ineffectively. This is how these kind of questions were sorted out in the Burmese kind of context. And so a lot of the work that I did in for the first part of the book, which is really on the 1990s and 2000s, was like, how did we get to a context where you have all of these organisations doing all sorts of fascinating kind of socially engaged forms of action, often framed around Buddhism and linked to business, and this idea of charitable culture, which has become so important to how people understand their civic kind of duty as well, that not just a good Buddhist, but a good Burmese person takes responsibility for their community, takes responsibility for others, and is kind of obligated to others. And so that's kind of where I start the story in some ways, of this sort of post-socialist kind of question about how market reform drives a shift in how Buddhist charity and the scope for Buddhist charity, but increasingly sort of what I call social outsourcing, the state shifting its social responsibilities over to private actors, but also to non-state actors of a variety of kinds, philanthropy, religious institutions, and even in sort of ceasefire contexts, a variety of community-based organisations and ethnic kind of health systems and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I have two main questions arising from that. And the first one I want to ask is looking at the state withdrawing some of their responsibility and putting that off on society. There's a couple of different ways I can think about that. A benign way and a way of them reneging on their responsibility and taking the latter first. Obviously, if a state is saying that we're no longer going to be providing, it's no longer our responsibility to be providing these services or those, and we want other people to have to step up. Well, if a state is not doing that, then what is a state? Then what is left to their duty and to defining what it is they are as an authority and what role are they fulfilling, if not that primary one? And there's a real negative, pessimistic way to look at it. But then on the other hand, as you were talking, there were other things that came to mind. Three different elements that came as you were talking. First is like thinking of the American example of like Carnegie or Rockefeller and these billionaire and how much are we hearing today in America? Like, why can't we have billionaires in 2025 like we had in 1925? Like, wouldn't the world be a better place if we had the Elon Musks and the and the other big names that were building libraries and schools and parks? I mean, like, how many in America, how many small towns do you go to, mine included, where the local library was built by a Carnegie or a Rockefeller, and like money was going in there, and it was this civic duty as they started to better their own holdings and their company, that they would look to give back in ways that benefited the whole community. So that's one thought that came up. The second is just thinking about JFK's injunction of that's not what your country can do for you, but what you could do for your country, and that kind of civic sense. And then the third is looking at this issue of parahita, and I think anyone that comes to Myanmar, if you ask them what impresses them about the country, one of the first things you'll hear is just the generosity. You'll just hear that people are blown away by the generosity. And there have been generosity indexes where like Myanmar ranks 1 or 2, and that's surprising to everyone that has never been to Myanmar. Those that have been, it's not surprising to. And for someone like myself, coming from a meditation or Buddhist background, that is the real call and connection, the heart connection that so many foreign practitioners feel, is just the way that these doors have been opened to them for practice and access, and how they're taken care of, and levels of generosity they've never seen outside in their own context. And so there is this the sense of parahita. It is this beautiful thing, this beautiful sense of coming from the Buddhist teachings of what it means to give and to share and to be generous, and how and this being kind of a spiritual parami in and of itself, a perfection that one wants to develop in and improve at, on this quest of purification. And so it's like balancing these two different perspectives of looking at it, and maybe there's also a sequence or a transition taking place where it might start at one point and then start to move in some other direction. But as you're talking, I'm just struck by this this tension of half of what I'm hearing are the way they're reneging their responsibility and just simply not doing what a state is charged to do with and pushing others to do it for them. And then half of what I'm hearing this is the beautiful qualities of parahita and comparing to the American examples of JFK and Carnegie and Rockefeller and kind of where these come together. So is that a tension that that you were looking at as you were tracking this progression, or were you seeing it as more on one side or the other? Or how was your perspective in looking at that?
I'm glad you raised a whole bunch of those questions. I mean, the one of the most important things that one of the kind of old volunteers at one of these aged care kind of facilities that developed in the 90s said to me was, I hope you are able to try and capture the good sides and the bad sides of all of this.
Yeah.
And I think it is a real, there are super complicated knotty and ethical and structural questions and systemic questions that kind of interplay and compete with each other. And I suppose at the very high level, you have to take the bigger political sociology kind of context, which is that the choice to do what I call social outsourcing, to engage in social outsourcing, came about because the BSPP was bankrupt. The 1990 elections happened, and NLD did really well in areas of the country where the military didn't have functional control in the 1990s and the early 1990s. And as a result, there was a strategic decision to shift, basically fiscal priority from social expenditure to the military. So the military doubles in size in the 1990s, right? And you look at, in my book, I have a basically early 1990s versus, a map going back to the basically early 1990s to the number of military installations by about 2011. And basically looking at how the penetration of the periphery, you might say, at a very high level. Basically, you go from the Myanmar military having very limited functional administrative control in the periphery to having basically military bases everywhere in the country by the early 2010s. And so on some metric, that strategy was a success of basically shifting their fiscal and social focus from social equity or some kind of socialist kind of ideology, albeit perverted and distorted by all of the dynamics of corruption and rent seeking and kind of ideological fusion that went on during the BSPP period. But it came at tremendous social cost, right? So at a very high level, and this is something I do a little bit in the book, is sort of look at what is the overall social cost that developmentally Myanmar got way left behind by every other country in the region that spent slightly more on social expenditure. But that actually what we need to do is also factor in how non-state expenditures played a role in support for the vulnerable. And so at a high level, there's a high level question, which is that there was a strategic decision to engage in social outsourcing. And that had the effect of worsening the human development and human insecurity through the 1990s and 2000s. But then there's also this kind of ideological question about the ethical nature of business. And I'm so glad that you raised this sort of parallel with American, robber barons and the kind of Gilded Age. It's something I do in the first part of the book, actually, where I look at how the history of this concept of what I call welfare capitalism, which within sort of policy and political science literature is quite a known kind of concept, and historically. But actually, sometimes it gives the wrong impression that it's like I'm suggesting that capitalism really delivered welfare. But basically, welfare capitalism was a concept that was put forward by Herbert Hoover, actually, who, not many people know this, actually had a mine in Shan State, where he trialed this idea of what he later called welfare capitalism.
Amazing.
Where he basically ran this compound where they ran, I believe, like a school and a clinic for the families and of workers in that mine. And then he subsequently, as kind of Commerce Secretary and as President, kind of championed this idea that actually you don't need to regulate the private sector. You don't actually need to regulate capitalism because enlightened capitalists, enlightened business people who care about productivity and who realize that their workers are the most important part of their business will invest in their workers and they will do that without the state having to intervene or regulate. And so this was an idea he championed through the 1920s. And this was a very popular idea amongst economists who trained especially at Cornell in the 1920s and early 1930s. Some of whom then went on to advise on Burma's Pidor plan.
Really?
And so this kind of concept of welfare capitalism completely was discredited and fell apart when the Depression hit. Right? Because basically, globally, the capacity for anyone who had private capital to just voluntarily give it away was, their willingness was zero and their capacity was, was, maybe they were hoarding funds and certainly there was evidence of that, but there was no willingness on behalf of the wealthy to give away voluntarily. And that's where you have New Deal politics and the rise of the American kind of skeletal welfare state, but the development of the American kind of welfare regime as it's kind of referred to in policy literature. But the parallels here, I think, is really interesting because the same idea and concept that you can kind of lightly regulate or encourage the private sector to engage in sort of social expenditure and welfare activities without the state having to contribute too much was a key philosophy of the Peter Orthard Plan. And which was this developmental plan that UNU put forward during basically a big spike in the price of rice, where the Burmese state was quite flush during the early independence period. And they said that what we're going to do is transform society through industrialization, urban industrialization, and we'll do that by basically controlling the price of rice and how much we pay farmers. We pay the peasants very little, and we sell it at a very high international price. And so this worked for a period, and then basically the price of rice drops. The funding for this scheme that dries up, but this idea of welfare capitalism gets embedded in various pieces of legislation, some of which still exist. So the Social Security Board, for instance, which was set up to basically for these urban industrial sectors. These pieces of legislation which were designed for, like, if you get into an accident in a factory, you can use the Social Security Board insurance that the individual worker and the employer co-contribute to on a monthly basis out of their salary, with the state contributing basically as little as possible. That it was this idea of capitalism kind of just leveling out its exploitation through mild regulation, but not the state having to actually intervene through any kind of significant social outlay. And so these kind of ideologies got embedded in the Social Security law, for instance, the Social Security Board, and that literally the same functions that got still function today for the Social Security Board of co-contributory models came about from basically the UNU ministers in dialogue with American-trained economists who loved this idea of welfare capitalism. And so I follow this idea of welfare capitalism from sort of its emergence in the post-colonial period as this sort of appealing concept that was a way to balance addressing the inequities that the colonial period had delivered, whilst also trying to embrace capitalism and trying to figure out how do you interact with global trade, how do you interact with, atahita business people who are engaging in, sort of selfish activity. How do you engage with those people as a society and as a state in a way that doesn't result in the same perpetuation of the exploitation that you saw during the colonial period? So that was a key tension of that kind of early kind of post-independence politics, where you had basically everyone was a communist or a socialist, and including in the Tupperware. And so then all of these tensions play out, and I explore this a bit in the book, that lead up to the 62 coup. But this concept of welfare capitalism falls dormant through the socialist period, and then re-emerges basically in the early 1990s, where all of a sudden you have this return to saying, well, if we're going to have capitalism again, and we're going to accept that capitalism needs to exist, how do we do that in a way that sort of tries to deliver some kind of social welfare in this sort of fitful way? And again, welfare capitalism doesn't really work as a approach to social development, but it is appealing for cash-strapped governments and free market kind of libertarians who believe that the individual should give their wealth away voluntarily because it's better for them ethically and morally. But also it's really good for big business people who don't want to be forced to pay tax, so they'll give away crumbs, either through providing voluntary rice dispersions to their workers, or occasionally sort of providing a thin-jan bonus or whatever, but actually not a systematic kind of solution. And so these kind of tensions that play out about robber barons and the Gilded Age actually have these kind of neat and fascinating and underexplored connections with post-colonial Burmese political and economic development strategy, and there needs to be a lot more kind of uncovered. But I think there's these fascinating parallels with these tensions that you're exploring about ethics of business, and is it better for people to give their wealth away, voluntarily, or to regulate and have the state engage in sort of taxation of those people or those businesses, and then deliver social welfare or coordinate or regulate to provide social welfare. And so those are some of the tensions that I kind of am interested in, and especially followed a lot in those 2010s period of when you transition to some kind of a more democratic regime. There's an expectation that the poor will benefit, that those who've been left behind will gain something out of this process of transition to democracy. And you do see an increase in education and health spending in those 2010 to 2020 period, but social welfare never increases beyond about less than 0.5% of the budget, of the union budget. Throughout that entire period, it doesn't increase above about 0.4% of the union budget. And that's compared to other regional countries where it's 5-10% of budget, sometimes more than, and you sort of think there's something here about priorities. And that's where I sort of look at these continuities and these ideas, and a lot of my work on the NLD, for instance, looks at how welfare capitalism, and it's not expressed necessarily in that way, but this idea that what democracy needs is moral business people who give away their wealth and support civil society and community-based organisations to take responsibility for themselves. We don't need to be increasing taxes too much, because that will stifle this culture of charity.
Right.
And so this kind of that position, you think, how do we reach to that point? And so that's where you kind of think, well, we need to look back in history, but then in terms of the possibilities of a new redistributive politics that's more inclusive and progressive, then you have to kind of understand where you've come from in order to understand what's possible.
Sure. So the other question I want to pull back from what you shared earlier about the history, and before I do, I just want to give one, I want to refer to something a Burmese friend, Theory, said to me that I've never forgotten and have quoted several times since, and that's that in talking about the state, she said, look, we as Burmese have never expected them to provide anything to us, and we never will, and we are fine if they don't. What we want is a system where they don't punish us and attack us for trying to help each other. Because that's what's happening now, and that was just it's devastating and traumatic to hear those words, but it just completely shifted the paradigm of hearing someone just say, we have no history, nor do we have any expectation the state will ever provide for us. This is not the system that we're in, and then she went on to say, we are fine to provide for each other. That's how we were raised, that's what we do, that's what we know how to do. We just don't want them to get in the way and exploit us as that happens. So just to lead off one comment that came in referring to some of the things you mentioned, I then want to ask a follow-up question about this, the response to Cyclone Nargis in 2008 is really seen as this pivotal moment that we've covered a lot on the podcast, and I covered in my own life. I was a trainer at the American Center, and I was at the heart of looking at my students and my participants that I was working with and seeing like civil society bonds and networks form in front of my eyes in a urgent emergency response to a natural disaster, which was not focused on anything else, was just focused on, oh, you know how to do this, and you know this connection, and you have this boat, and you know these supplies, and just literally saving lives from people who had never done that. But then once people then moved out of the urgent crisis with Nargis, those connections remained. And I have friends who set up, I don't even want to call them organizations because, it's not a question of being that formal, but okay, you can call it an organization. But I have friends who set up things that just kind of gave themselves names or gave their group of friends names only to respond to Nargis that are continuing to do work to this day. So so a couple of things happened in Nargis that I saw and that I've seen as documented. One is that I don't know what words one wants to use, it strengthened or it formed or it came to it manifested these stronger civil society bonds to respond to this urgent crisis, which then those networks, once they were there, they remained, and they were able to go on and do other things. That was one thing it did, that from the Burmese perspective. From the American perspective especially, and this has been well documented, is that and Scott Marcial, the ambassador at the time, who has, or not, it wasn't the ambassador then, later he was the ambassador, but he was involved in Burma at the time of Nargis. When he was on the podcast, he says as much as well, that it shifted the American understanding of what democracy was with a small d. And that it allowed them to start to see that these kind of democracy frameworks that they were used to applying to other countries, that they needed to think outside the box in Myanmar. And they needed to realize that if community members were coming together to perform some function or provide some service or help their community, which the blood banks, the free funeral services, all these things that you mentioned, these are first and foremost examples that maybe we need to start putting money and support into these activities that don't fit our usual frameworks, because they are then a stepping ground that can continue on to something else. And that and this was also a time where so much of the conversation pre-Nargis was dominated by this on the part of a lot of American policymakers that you could not do any good in Myanmar, that all of the support and the funds needed to happen in Mae Sot and outside, because there was the sense that there was so much repression and so much people were so repressed that there was really very little you could do inside the country. But Nargis changed that dynamic into opening up new ways of thinking, that you can start to support these non-conventional and non-traditional ways of civil society engagement, with the explicit hope that you would start by doing things that weren't explicitly calling out freedoms and human rights and democracy and everything else, but with the hope that these networks, when formed, would just as a human condition would start to lead in this direction.
I think that's fascinating, and I think it's interesting to hear the American kind of policy vantage on that. But I think there's from a political sociology perspective, you use the word manifest, that Nargis manifested a set of relationships, but also a set of ideas. And this is sort of the argument that I make in the first part of the book, which is sort of that by the late 1990s, this idea of having social space, that you could actually get some private funding from people within the community who weren't necessarily complete state lackeys, but might be willing to support, an initiative in a village for supporting the tuition of younger at-risk kids or whatever, but also in this kind of disaster context of saying there are people in need and no one's doing anything. And this, these sets of ideas and the kind of networks and practices of, general fundraising, of going to the street and asking people to contribute and saying, if you donate for, disaster relief, that you will be, and monks encourage this interpretation, you're doing something that is, you're going to earn you good merit. And again, this is sort of this expanding concept of how parahita and gudo, kind of the social scope of karma in the Burmese Buddhist kind of cosmology begins to expand in the 1990s and 2000s. And then Nargis is a fascinating demonstration and manifestation, as you say, because you see these local networks. And I talk about it in the book as sort of, you move from a focus on the local to the translocal, to saying actually from someone who I've never met on the other side of the country is in need. We've heard that they're in need. We've maybe seen images of it, and there's an emotional connection. Right? There's this sort of sense of how can I see suffering and do nothing. Right? And that's where the sociology of the 1990s and 2000s lays the groundwork for what we then see during Nargis, which is all of a sudden it springs up into international attention. What was already happening at a local level, that was laying the groundwork for a set of ideas and a set of networks and practices to say, well, like we've been able to respond to local crises. get some resourcing for it. Everyone is willing to chip in because they know that the state is useless. So let's all, we'll ask business people obviously to donate substantially more. And actually the state, the Slok SPDC did encourage actually business people especially. They met with chambers of commerce and allocated them responsibility for reconstruction efforts in different parts of the country after Nargis. And then basically those chambers of commerce then had to go out and partner with these local organisations with volunteers to actually go out and facilitate and deliver aid. And so you see this kind of dynamic of apolitical kind of civil society, and it's super interesting to hear your perspective and Scott Marciel's perspective about how the American kind of framing of this moment shifted how they understood democracy, because this kind of concept of apolitical civil society has been kind of used in some of this literature about Myanmar, and I actually argue it's intensely political to kind of both allow heavily suppress the NLD throughout the 1990s and 2000s, whilst allowing these kinds of organisations to develop. That was a very political decision.
It's kind of playing with fire, right?
Well, it's playing with fire in the sense that it's providing a social space, right?
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things that then, when I did research in around 2014, 15, 16, 17, a lot of the people who ran these organisations from the 1990s onwards were intensely pro-NLD.
Yeah.
But they kept a low profile about their political opinions through the 1990s and 2000s at least, in order to be able to continue to do the work that they did. So it wasn't that the decision to allow these groups to develop with the social space as long as they remained apolitical, that wasn't an apolitical decision. It was a very political decision. But then the kind of ways that people understood the work that they were doing was also very civic. And political, and a certain concept of democracy as to how it was being practiced, that democracy requires people who care for each other, take responsibility for themselves and their community. And that, Aung San Suu Kyi wrote through the 1990s and the 2000s about, society needing that individual liberation requires people to engage in societal liberation practices. So, the idea of ending a cycle of individual samsara requires you to engage in some kind of social action. She encouraged this interpretation through the 1990s and 2000s. And that, again, is this sort of, from both the military dictatorship in the 1990s that encouraged charitable and philanthropic action, then you have the democratic opposition that was, from a completely different standpoint, saying that democratic action requires people to engage in charity. And so it becomes this social space, right, where people could engage in small p political, and I call it in one of my kind of earliest kind of attempts to grapple with this as sort of the limits of big P politics. That like this whole concept of like, party politics, didn't exist. And then you go to the local, welfare organisations, and they have very thick ideas about what democracy is, how it should be practiced, their responsibility. And not necessarily, and this is perhaps surprising in terms of the endpoint, that the expectation isn't necessarily that you then transition to some kind of more democratic system and the state fills the gap, right? And so this is where you enter into the kind of, from a micro level to the macro level of the systematic kind of inequity baked into this, is that people's expectations of the state were so low that their concept of democracy was a negative one. It was freedom from fear, right? So, which is how Aung San Suu Kyi framed it. Freedom to not be suppressed and attacked. But it wasn't necessarily freedom to have your needs met. Or freedom to support your flourishing as an individual or society's kind of flourishing, which was a very different kind of political vision from, say, the Pirota vision of UNU, for example, which is very much state-led developmentalism in the 1950s, right? And so there's this kind of interesting minimization of what people could expect and should expect. And for very justifiable reasons. They've experienced nothing but a highly repressive state when it comes to politics, and a state that sometimes suppressed charity, but basically was just willing to let it run as long as it didn't present too many problems, because mostly the Tatmadaw was focused on suppressing the periphery through the 1990s and 2000s through, building and expanding military bases and, ceasefire capitalism, as it's been termed by colleagues like Kevin Woods. And so you see these kind of expanding scope of politics, actually, but in these everyday kind of things that you see during Nargis. And I find disasters in Myanmar to be fascinating, and the earthquake most recently is a really important example of this sense of kind of social obligation that people have to support people who they've never met before, but they know that if they don't do anything, that maybe no one will, or the state certainly won't be an effective responder. And it then means that you have lots of small organizations doing amazing work. Not necessarily coordinating always, often duplicating, not necessarily thinking beyond, and there's a lot of Burmese colleagues of mine who are working on trying to do more coordination and thinking more medium term outside of the immediate sort of like, let's get people, rice, but also begin to think about like, what's the medium term livelihood strategy for agricultural communities that have been devastated by a cyclone? Like, how do we fill out their livelihoods for the next, 6 months to a year, and beginning to think in a more structural way? So there's limits to non-state response, but I think there's this interesting dynamic around disasters in Myanmar that has recurrently reminded people that the state is ineffective, lacking in compassion. Its priorities are political above all else, and that therefore people need to step up and fill the bridge, and do that in a way that stretches these local mechanisms and ideas and practices and stretches them into helping people on the other side of the country. And sometimes that requires very emotional kind of appeals. I explore this a bit in some of our research, that the idea of kinship, for instance, comes up a lot when you follow the songs that get sung. Then it's like, our brothers and sisters are drowning in this cyclone. We need to reach out a hand and pull them from the waters. They're sort of like, immediately you're like, oh God, like this is really really hits you. But it is also, requires that level of emotion to get people to contribute. And so there's this sort of imagined kinship of a kind of almost intimate nature, that what I call kind of social citizenship or moral kind of citizenship, that runs alongside what in the literature about the welfare state. We talk about social citizenship, like your entitlement from the state. I argue that this is, in the Burmese context, what I think of as kind of moral citizenship, which is the capacity to make claims or receive support from a moral community that might be, Buddhists, it might be people from your university network who are coming to support you, or it might be people from the other side of the country who just saw images on Facebook and wanted to come and help. But that, there's inequalities baked into moral citizenship, where if you don't, if people don't see photos of you suffering, how will people know about the emotional connection and obligation that they have? And so there's a reason why a state exists, to be able to respond and address inequalities. But in the Burmese context, the state has been absent and actually nefarious. And so moral citizenship has kind of this kind of concept and practice and set of ideas springs up through the 1990s and 2000s, backed by private capital. The capacity that there was non-state sources of funding to be able to support and resource these kinds of initiatives. And that, post-coup, it's these kinds of dynamics that now I don't think we can understand the resistance, the resilience of PDFs, the resilience of rural struggle against the new dictatorship, without understanding how some of these concepts and mechanisms have evolved, and then since the coup, how things are beginning to change as well now.
Sure, and what you say reminds me of my interview with Elliot Prase Freeman, of his characterization of the state being both everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And but going to this sense of the relationship between the people and the state, I'm struck by another contrast and tension, which is that you have a state which is not providing any of the services that usually one expects and that the people need and they can't do for themselves, and then really manipulating and exploiting a largely Buddhist understanding, probably fitting in other categories as well, but certainly a Buddhist understanding of generosity and giving. And I mean, certainly this is not the first time that the military has relied on Burmese concepts or Buddhist concepts to stoke certain kinds of fears and anxieties and motivations and such for other ends. So there's some kind of exploitation going on there, but yet at the same time, one can't entirely move away from just that there's something very beautiful about this. There's something very beautiful about the kinship and the giving to someone that you've never met that's in a faraway place, and and moving to the revolution today, the sacrifice that we've seen from all parts, from PDF to diaspora to NUG to just the list goes on and on of what kinds of support, resistance, resilience, sacrifice has been necessary, and even the word sacrifice. I don't know how many times I've been with a Burmese friend and have referenced that term sacrifice, and they've really corrected me, and they've said, please do not say what I'm doing is a sacrifice. This is something I'm giving with my full heart, that I'm joyous in doing, that I believe in, and by all intents and purposes, what they're doing is a sacrifice. I mean, when you see what the people that I'm referencing that I've spoken to, when you actually look objectively at the risk they're taking on and what they're giving up, I don't know any other word for it, but they're adamant that they do not want that word used. They do not, from their own agency, they do not see what they're doing as a sacrifice. And so there's I've often said one of the things that continues to draw me so much and my passion and my support and the work that I do is from being inspired by just how much the Burmese are giving, and whether I get in trouble saying this or not, the sacrificing, how much they're giving and sacrificing, and how much they're caring and how much they're supporting. And that's what motivates me every day. I look at what I'm doing as in the tail of the way they've blazed the trail, and I'm just trying to look at that trail and follow in how I can, and I've also said that I don't know how many other societies you can find and communities you could find that have been through what they've been through and that still continue to have that duty to help each other and support each other and to be generous. And so I'm struck again by this tension and contrast of a state that has shifted this responsibility and not done what they should be doing to provide for their people, and yet on the other hand, this very beautiful quality that has emerged and that has its roots in Buddhism as well as other cultures and religions and frameworks. But that has really taken on this life and this character that I wouldn't want to see changed in a way. I wouldn't want to see. Of course, I'd want the state to provide more services, but I guess I'm wondering: is there a way to reimagine a way forward where the state can provide things that it hasn't traditionally done beyond welfare capitalism, and yet this beautiful quality of caring for each other and feeling a civic duty that doesn't get removed as a result of the state taking on a greater role?
I think this is a really core tension, right, about how you imagine the possibilities for a more fair and inclusive society, but also a core tension of the 2010s, where there was big debates about whether there should be a social protection kind of strategy from the Naypyidaw government that expands cash transfers to vulnerable populations. And it was the beginning of this. They just started an aged pension and some cash transfers to new mothers in the 2010s. But this was a core tension, right? And a question that often came up was like, well, we don't want to discourage Myanmar's charitable culture.
Right. Interesting.
And so there's this kind of question there about whether there is a risk of crowding out more systematic solutions to social problems from that immediate expectation that, like, well, in order for the state to do more, we need to tax more. And that I think is actually a key kind of question. And I think, like, if you follow debates about tax in Myanmar over time, and in the contemporary context, you learn a lot about political authority. So you follow the money, you learn a lot, and I think that a lot of the kind of opposition to the idea of the state assuming more responsibility came not necessarily, partly from an idea of where we don't want to crowd out charity, but also there was this kind of other fear, which is how do we fund it? So if it means someone will need to pay more tax, and that's difficult. Myanmar has a long history of anti-tax rebellions going back to the colonial period. There's a lot of historical context there. The Sayasan rebellion was basically in the 1930s was basically a anti-tax rebellion that then formed the basis of the independence movement, and was one of the other reasons why welfare capitalism was very attractive. But I think this is a core kind of question now, where after the coup, there is this debate about how does the NUG, for example, deliver governance? How does it support resistance? How does it support social kind of response after the earthquake, for example, by trying to raise revenue? And often they've relied on things like lotteries or kind of more voluntary forms of people giving up resources or funds. But this kind of question about how do you fund social benefits is a really central kind of question now to how the NUG operates at a township level, where trying to tax agricultural goods at checkpoints, for example, is now a major source of tension between local PDFs and rural communities who've been supporting them for years.
Right.
And so there's this kind of dynamic of there's what we call in academia this kind of fiscal social contract, where if the state wants to begin to demand more, it needs to enter into this kind of social kind of reciprocity, and that that people will get something back from paying in. And frankly, I think it's been a very long time since people have seen that level of reciprocity and directness between the money they pay in tax and the things they get back. And they directly compare it to charity, right? And so actually, I think it's very unlikely that all of a sudden Myanmar is going to develop a Norwegian welfare state and crowd out charity.
Yeah.
I think what is more likely is that the state has a lot to learn from the non-state sector. So the almost obsessive focus on accountability, on directness,
right.
on being able to know that if you pay a tax, that it actually does have an effect of alleviating suffering in the community, or it does have a demonstrable effect on delivering a social good, like a local road, or a road somewhere that's been kind of sort of built as a result of your contributions. And so this kind of circle of positive communications has never really existed in the Burmese, post-colonial Burmese state has struggled to communicate to people, whether urban or rural, why they would pay tax and get something, how they would get something back from it. And that, I think, is actually, where probably there's more likely to be something learned from the non-state sector, which is not going to disappear. I mean, even during those 2010 periods, during that 2010s period, charity massively expanded. I mean, even at a philanthropy perspective, KBZ Bank claimed to have donated more than they paid in tax during the entire 2010s. I mean, just think about that. I mean, it's the largest bank in the country, and they say that they donated more through their foundation than they did pay in tax. And it gets a bit more complicated because donations are tax deductible in the Burmese context. And so then they paid less tax as a result of their donations as well. But, these kinds of questions actually, I think it's unlikely that even in a boom time, charity's not going to go anywhere. It's now embedded. It's what in political science we call path dependent. That once you've created a sociology of charity and philanthropy, it doesn't disappear. It evolves. It changes. It would take a long time for the entire culture of non-state welfare to completely transform. And I think what is more likely is that the state might try to mimic the aspects of the non-state sector which people have faith in. I mean, I've done surveys about this during the NLD time, where we asked people about tax versus non-state, donations, and it's just apples and oranges. Like 85% of people are confident that when they give a donation, that it has some kind of demonstrable effect on addressing a social need, and it's like more like 40% or less for tax. And the Burmese word akun, which is used for tax, actually is the same word that's used for like miakun, like electricity meters, like electricity bills. So even how you interpret that survey result of people don't have faith that when they pay tax it goes somewhere, that's also including that, like, when you pay your electricity bill, do you feel it goes to actually keeping the lights on or not, right?
Wow.
And so even that relationship is murky, and we wouldn't necessarily call that a tax, right? It's just your electricity bill. But in the Burmese, kind of the way that the people interpret that, we might interpret that survey result, right? It's actually really, the fact that even 40% of people are confident, is quite remarkable. When you compare it to like 80% of people who give, or 85% of people who give to charity. And so there's something there about the nature of making sure that people know where money goes, how it's distributed, and this is something you see a lot with PDFs, for instance. I mean, the resistance is remarkably transparent. People raise funds for supporting the resistance, and the amount of effort that has gone through to say, like, this is what we need to, basically have enough rice or supplies to support displaced people coming from airstrikes. This is how much we need, and then you go out and purchase it or procure it. Photos will be sent back to the donors with receipts, as well as potentially a whole register, and you see this of all the names of people and households who've been benefited from those kind of humanitarian support that have been coordinated by local people's defence forces. And so you see this kind of digital forms of almost obsessive transparency that sometimes from an outside perspective are like, guys, is this safe? Like, we've got this much information about things going, but it actually the greater good that they feel is being served is that there is both a faith and trust that if you give your time and you give your resources, that it will have a benefit. And that also has something to do with a Buddhist idea of directness, and also being transformed in the gift of giving yourself or giving something. You are yourself transformed. So if you don't know if someone has actually benefited, it's hard to feel like you've transformed yourself in the process of being generous or engaging in generous behaviour.
Paying tax is not a spiritual benefit, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. And I mean, the history of welfare states comparatively, actually, often people begin to be willing to pay more tax under two conditions: when the state begins to actually show that they're giving something back, and when often the state begins to sacralize giving tax, paying tax. So you begin to make it in some way sacred, and that this sort of sense of like it's your civic duty, or you're actually, it's a form of compassion to be able to pay tax is something not negative, but something which comes with the capacity to solve all sorts of social issues within the community, and that's something you should feel really positive about. And so, I think that is probably more likely than crowding out of the NGO or sort of a community-based charitable sector. That is a far more likely outcome, I think, that the state begins to think, oh, there's something that we could learn from this non-state sector to try and justify people contributing to the state, however it's conceived, and beginning to nudge towards some kind of a concept of when you give, you actually get something back occasionally, at least.
This is reminding me of a conversation we had years ago with Philip Anawit when he was talking in the early days of the establishment of the NUG, the CRPH, the NUCC, and he was in one part of the conversation. He was talking about the volunteer nature of that, and again, use the word or not, sacrifice, how most people in the NUG don't have any salary at all. Those who do, it's a very small salary. And and this was years ago, so I'm trying to remember the correct dynamics of this conversation because it was so fascinating. I think there was a part where Philip Anawit was stressing to those people involved in the NUG how important it was that they did find some way to provide salaries for their bureaucracy, for the not just the ministers, but the people doing anything from accounting to writing to any other part of what was involved, and the hundreds, I think thousands of people that are involved somehow in the NUG, and that for the bureaucracy they're trying to set up, that it really for the good of the bureaucracy and the structure and the unit they're setting up, that some kind of core funding is necessary, and that core funding should go towards salaries to be able to keep people there what they were doing. And just the immense level of resistance he got from anyone in wanting a salary, and talking about the civic duty and the responsibility and how this would take away their spiritual benefit or their joy or whatever it was, but that really that this went against the whole spirit of what they were doing. And I was struck in hearing this, because this conversation exposed me both to kind of the greatest and almost like singular and unique achievement of what the Burmese have done in what they've set up, and also kind of one of the greatest obstacles and challenges for being able to then move on, in the sense that what other community under these conditions would have a spirit where so many would willingly come together to want to want to set something up without thinking of any kind of remuneration, to just for the good of their country and what this unit is trying to do and trying to administer. And it's just something to be celebrated and respected and tip your hat to, and really just in awe that an organization like this could exist with these people wanting to give in this way. What other sustained effort could you find in other examples? I think very few, if any. And yet, so that's the more optimistic and positive side. And yet the concern is that isn't this kind of the problems that we've seen so much historically, is the lack of institutions, the lack of sustainability, the lack of long-term thinking and development that's able to do the boring work, because no one likes bureaucracy, but do the boring work to set up institutions with long-term vision that can continue to function and continue to have people that come in and that are and that can operate and be compensated for their time at some level to continue doing that work for the long-term vision. But there was so much resistance to even thinking like this. Like, it was just an anathema to it was so many of these of those that he was talking to, just they would recoil at just the thought of bringing in, it was like money polluted this, like it took away the whole spirit of what they were trying to do. And this was said if I remember correctly, this was said in concert also with this concern that, and I'm sure you know this, it's something that's been commonly talked about, that often those in leadership positions were chosen not so much of their capability, but of their sacrifice, of what they had already given, of how many years they had spent as a political prisoner, or how much they had given to the movement, or how much they had their purity in showing themselves for aspiring for democratic ideals. And so this kind of went along with this notion, and why I'm bringing that up, and the contrast I'm making is that these are both examples of things that are just incredibly heartwarming and have a certain purity about them and have even a beauty to them, but they're also questionable in terms of long-term effectiveness for what it is they're trying to build. So,
right. I mean, how sustainable is the NUG project without revenue? And then how does that revenue get spent and distributed? And they've done, an amazing job at trying to find creative ways to raise revenue. But I mean, you talk to local resistance groups and they're like, yeah, sure, the NUG has all these directives, but like, ultimately, if they don't have much money to be able to support us, then we have to do what we need to do at a local level. And whether that involves like trying to engage in logging and selling logs as a source of revenue, even though the NUG says that technically we're not allowed to do that. We're going to try and do that because that's going to be a source of revenue for us that the NUG can't make up for us. And so in some ways there's you use the word kind of purity, and I think there's a really interesting kind of split here between like a commercial economy of salaries and jobs and sort of business and deals, and a moral economy of kind of moral obligation of cetana, of clean and pure intentions in the way that you operate, and that in some ways that kind of conceptualization or kind of bifurcation of those two spheres has its is a long root in capitalism and the way it functions, but in the 1990s in particular, that split very much was like, if you can do business and you can be ruthless in your business, but you also need to demonstrate to the military and to society that you were giving back in some way, and that if you were seen to be being greedy or using charitable funds for your own purposes, and that was the worst thing that your like societal perception would be absolutely shot, but also your own the way that individual cycles of reincarnation would be affected by you trying to steal money that was supposed to be for the community or those who are needy. It's like, well, you've damned society, but you've also damned yourself in some kind of way in terms of your own moral aspiration, right? And so I think that there are echoes, and I think there are some Burmese researchers who are exploring some of these, like the mutation of these ideas from Buddhism and from kind of broader kind of popular moral culture, and how they continue to shape post-coup politics. And this is one of the really fascinating ones where it's sort of, the NUG is super concerned about being perceived to be taking a bunch of money and spending it on hotels, or living in nice places in Western countries. And obviously this has been a debate that's played out within the NUG, such that they've tried to position themselves increasingly in Myanmar and making sure that their ministers are increasingly based in Myanmar. And so these kind of tensions or perceptions, they are a key critique that you get from non-NUG affiliated people. Like, it's a fair enough concern that the people in the NUG might feel like, if we look like we're taking salaries, that we're misusing money for the revolution in some way. But it does run to this systematic and sustainable question of how sustainable is it that people can struggle or give themselves for years and years and years. The human and social effect of that on people's families, on their relationships, on their health. Is immense, and you saw this in people in the 1990s and after '88 who just fell apart physically, mentally, and their family relationships ruptured because they gave themselves so much, but then just weren't able to find a sustainable way because of the nature of political struggle is costly and horrible, and I would hate to be in a leadership role in the NUG, trying to navigate all of these complexities and doing that in a way that's sort of politically sustainable and also personally sort of sustainable. But I think those tensions are, you see even within the resistance. How do you do protection of the local village without also losing sight of the fact that you still have a family that you have to feed, and these kind of constant trade-offs are the terrible decisions that people have to face when they're struggling against a dictatorship. It's sort of I'm perpetually amazed at the horrible moral trade-offs that people have to make, and their involvement in violence, which is often ugly. And one of a Burmese researcher who's been working on kind of concepts within the resistance, and one of the interesting things that has come out of their research is how there's often a focus on defence rather than offence in PDFs, because of the kind of Buddhist kind of framing of that is that you're protecting lives, you're not taking lives, and that even though within the resistance sometimes there is this sort of reticence to say that Buddhism plays a role in PDFs or within the resistance, and that there's this sort of often an international framing that like, Myanmar's revolution is very secular, but that when you look at these kinds of dynamics of how appeals for donations or appeals for just the way that people understand their everyday work to try and engage in bringing down the dictatorship, that often some of these tensions around, can we conceptualize this as protection, or do I have to accept that I'm engaging in taking lives in an offensive way, like the 1027 kind of offensive, that people who may never have dreamt that they have to face these incredibly complicated moral quandaries, 5-6 years ago may never have dreamt of engaging in drone bombings and that kind of stuff, and now faced with these terrible moral quandaries and decisions, and sort of all of these are building on a ideological and theological and sort of cosmological history that people now have to navigate and figure out how they still try and be good morally, or see themselves and feel that they're living lives which are part of a bigger struggle. And it's incredible to see how everyone is finding their little ways to pitch in, even migrant workers who are in Thailand finding ways to contribute a couple of bucks a month that supports to protecting their village and supporting the revolution in some small kind of way. It's quite amazing from a moral kind of perspective, but an aspect of this whole resistance and revolution that gets a bit lost sometimes, and one that I think we need to kind of unpack some of these older kind of categories and anxieties, and how they're kind of playing out in new ways after the coup.
Are there other examples you can think of that are that are Buddhist themes or elements that are underlying the way that this current resistance and revolution is playing out?
Yeah, I think a key one is that kind of conception of benefiting from the resistance, and how people kind of navigate that question of wearing multiple hats as well, where they're sort of simultaneously the head of a PDF in a village, but they're also responsible for regulating business or trade in the area, and how they make sure they don't come across as being rent-seeking from one position to another. Like, these are really big kind of tensions, and the complexity is often that resistance actors end up being asked to join initiatives because they're like, you lend legitimacy to us, we're trying to do support for displaced people within this area, but we need someone with your kinds of connections. Can you bring some business people along who can be, or traders who can help us, stockpile some food or whatever? And so you end up with these kind of, reluctant, resistance fighters who are involved in all sorts of civilian kinds of activities, which gets really complicated from a civil military perspective, where the arms carriers are involved in all sorts of activities of a civilian sort of nature.
Humanitarian and local governance.
And in some ways that's, there's some variance, and I have some research with the Burmese colleague which is exploring some of these dynamics, but in Chin States it's a bit different, where there's a bit more of a rigid civil military divide actually in kind of how local governance is structured. But these kind of anxieties actually, people reluctantly pulled in to be involved in, and sometimes willingly brought in to be involved in these kind of committees that, give them the influence to regulate traders, or, kind of perhaps being involved in business themselves in this context before the coup, and then all of a sudden they're also involved in a resistance force, but they still have a family business that's, trying to do trade after the coup, and those kind of tensions. I mean, I've some of the people I know who've been involved in these dynamics, they struggle with how to kind of navigate this in a way that doesn't look as if they're benefiting, and sometimes they feel like they have to put their family first, and try and escape the context for a period and then come back and sort of trying to navigate those. I wouldn't say they're necessarily exclusively Buddhist by any means, but I think some of those feelings that you might be seen to be benefiting from the resistance or your involvement in the revolution or whatever is something which is both there in the critique of some resistance actors who are, for example, running checkpoints where they're taxing people who are going through, and that some people feel frustrated that they're being taxed as they pass through and feel like the resistance forces are just doing it for their own personal benefit, kind of thing, right? And so there are those kinds of dynamics of how do you navigate funding local resistance and social public goods at the same time as not coming across as just extorting people at a checkpoint, and the balance of that is complicated to strike, but is also framed by that kind of moral economy and the fact that people are supporting each other, and that there are these kind of underlying ideas that you shouldn't perhaps be benefiting from your involvement in political activity in some way.
And yet to be sustainable, you need warm food to eat during the day and need a place to sleep at night.
Well, I mean, and you need to be able to fund a supply of food for displaced people.
Of course,
but again, it comes back to this question about trust and faith, and perhaps people feel like they're being just shaken down at some of these checkpoints that are now sprung up all around kind of rural areas of Myanmar from resistance forces in response to all of these SAC checkpoints that's the entry points to cities that are taxing everything and everyone that passed through. Resistance forces are taxing far less than the SAC are. So just for the balance of conversation, it's worth making that point that the SAC's taxation has massively changed rural livelihoods after the coup, but that actually the resistance is trying to do this in a moral and ethical kind of way, in a way that sort of, I've heard kind of talked about in this kind of way of like a social contract. Like they're like, if we're going to start to collect more tax, we need to begin to pay something back. And the NUG has kind of frameworks around revenue sharing, where some of the money goes to the NUG, some of it goes to the local armed carriers, the local resistance forces, and some of the revenue that they raise from checkpoints goes to local social governance and education, health, and support for displaced people, that kind of thing. And so there is a moral and ethical attempt to try and make checkpoint taxation, for example, moral, right? Or at least ethically consistent with the concept of a sort of, there is an authority which is trying to exert power over you, but it's doing it for your own greater good in some way. And that's completely different from the ethical framework of how the SAC is extorting people and assaulting people. And, men from villages don't want to go into towns because they're constantly concerned about being, shaken down, beaten up, and extorted from by often, drunk or drugged up, SAC fighters who have been told the only food that you have to eat and your only source of salary is the money that you manage to raise from this checkpoint, right? And so, in some ways there's, this resource scarcity across the board, but there is at least an ethical attempt. And I suppose that's to come back to the broader question about how, these kind of ethical frameworks get kind of imposed or shape the resistance. That I think it's super clear that when the resistance tries to tax people or set up social governance, they're trying to navigate these sets of social and moral expectations that people have of what an authority would, that is responsive to their needs and represents them, how they would behave. And so they're trying to negotiate and bargain and figure out what that actually looks like, and that will take some time to figure out. And, there will be tensions, no doubt, and, frustrations that people feel like they're being extorted, but it runs this bigger challenge about how you run a parallel state apparatus that has basically no international support, very limited support from the international community for any of this kind of social governance in more than half the country that is in resistance held areas, where all of these education and health systems basically receive next to no support from the international community, and especially since USAID kind of withdrew. And so there's these kinds of questions as well about trying to do a lot with very little resourcing and keep the struggle going, but all of that should suggest that things should have ended by now, right? But that's kind of why I argue that you have to look back at the 1990s and the 2010s to understand why people are finding ways to support and sustain resistance, where, years after the coup, and these resistance groups are not fading away. They're continuing, and they're really kind of surprisingly and shockingly resistant to a lot of international observers. Like, oh, why hasn't the resistance? I remember having conversations with international observers and analysts in the weeks and months after the coup, and they're like, oh, the CDM and all this, it's just going to dry up. I mean, they'll just run out of money after a couple of months. I was like, I don't rule it out, man. Like, this is it's going to be sustained, and those people have since changed their positions and be like, oh, actually, there's a bit more to this. Like, actually, these things run a bit deeper, and the willingness of people to just, engage in a completely different moral economy where they're thinking intergenerationally, right? It's not about them. It's about what kind of society we're handing on to our children. And, that is an extraordinary arc of time to be able to imagine that actually you might not ever see the benefits of your participation in this revolution, but hopefully your children or perhaps your children's children will be able to benefit from what you've been able to do in your lifetime to sustain that. And that's, that's where the ethical and moral kind of frameworks, you really need to dig into those and how they intersect with the political economy of the 1990s and 2000s and are continuing to shape the possibility of resistance. And hopefully, once this political impasse resolves itself in some kind of way, will be, the major leading partner in how Myanmar navigates what is the future and how they navigate all these decisions about how to structure a state that's more inclusive politically, socially, and economically.
But then it does, hearing this also raises the ethical question to me on the role of the international community and the international aid organizations of when you're looking at engaging and supporting civil society in Myanmar and local organizations. The opinions that you've, the analysis you've shared in this conversation, it's made me think of things in a way I never have before when it comes to international aid and support in giving Myanmar, just the more nuanced nature and ethical decision making that I've never considered before, in the sense that I've always seen this growth of civil society and service-oriented individuals and organizations and generosity and these networks that have been set up. I've always seen it as a net positive thing, as something that is, again, I keep using this word, this beautiful part of the culture and the people, and that we can only be so privileged to be able to tap into and to support. And so whether you're looking at small organizations like ours as Better Burma and the humanitarian work we do, or whether you're looking at bigger organizations or very large organizations, either international relief or USAID as it used to exist, or other government aid programs from other Western countries, when you're looking at delivering that aid to supporting those local groups that are doing good for each other, on the surface of it, this just seems like something that if you have these trusted networks you can tap into, and you get to see, you can put the funds there, and then you can get reports and see the results of what these funds were able to do and how it was also able to build up those communities. There wasn't any real new ethical nuance that I had ever considered that needed to be looked at there. But there's another way of looking at this and perceiving this from the things that you've shared in this conversation, that and from smaller organizations, maybe it's not so much of an ethical consideration because the monies that you're talking about are so much smaller. But for very large organizations, I think it does come to be a question if you're pouring all of those funds into these local networks and individual groups that are then supporting their community. In some ways, you're enabling. You're enabling the continuation of the state being able to withdraw and to leave it to its own devices. Now, this is not so much of a relevant argument today, where we're in conflict and the state is basically functioning in order to assault its own people. So at the moment, this is maybe not so much of an ethically nuanced conversation, but I think it certainly would be during the transition. It certainly would be before the transition, and imagining a post-military Myanmar or whatever comes next, it could be relevant then as well, and looking at giving larger sums of money to these organizations that are seemingly doing great work, but then looking from a larger framework, are you enabling a setup where the state can be stripped of its responsibilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole bunch of questions there, right, about the nature of the state as it could evolve. But I kind of see the concept of social outsourcing as really largely a descriptive one, right? That it's what has happened, and it has an afterlife. The afterlife of it, as it's happened, is that actually the flip side of social outsourcing is that it meant that state programs didn't, or the expectation of the state to, for example, engage in rural development. There was a particular conception about individual and community responsibility, which was embedded in that 2010 period. So like when the state distributed support, it was done in a way where it was targeted towards communities who had already shown that they were willing to co-contribute alongside the state. So basically this paradoxical idea of self-reliance or go-to-go-ta, that if your community had shown that you had built your own local village road, then they were much more likely in the 2010s to have got to get a rural development scheme in that village than the village next door that had not either, maybe they hadn't done the village road themselves, or they had done it but hadn't performed it and made it clear to people at a township level that they had gone and built their own road. So it wasn't just the act of doing it, but it was the performance of, look how self-reliant we are. We are very, we help ourselves. We don't turn to the state to solve our problems. Right. And a kind of citizenship which was rewarded was one in the 2010s which said, if you show yourself that you're willing to not rely on the state, we will be more likely to give you state funds.
Interesting.
Right? So what the consequence of that is that villages perhaps next door, which were poorer, why wouldn't you build your own road when everyone else is doing it? Because you have less money, because you're on a floodplain that you're constantly having to, move where the roads are, because of you're next to a river or you're constantly fleeing disaster. Or you're from a minority, you're a ranger, or you're from a religious community which is seen to be morally less, or you have a history of conflict with the government, and therefore you say, why should we be building? This is something I saw in Northern Karen State amongst Christian Karen communities. Said, why should we build our own roads? They, if they want a ceasefire with us, then they need to bring us something.
Yeah.
And so they would refuse to do that, to build their own roads in order to then get government funds, right? So there's this dynamic in the 2010s where this idea of self-reliance was very problematic in excluding communities that actually should have been the beneficiaries from a poverty alleviation perspective. They should have received arguably more than those communities next door, but certainly everyone should have been receiving sort of state rural development. But there was this conception that we have limited resources, we don't have that much money, we need to be very austere about how we spend it, right? So then this has the effect of perpetuating inequalities during the 2010s. So it has that negative consequence. But then the flip side of this is that social outsourcing has also created these practices and ideals of go-to-go-ta, of help yourself. That you need to solve your problems locally, you can't rely and expect the state to be able to solve those or contribute. Maybe you'll get some co-contribution if you're lucky from government actors or from the NUG, but you basically just need to go ahead and do it yourself. And so it's this dynamic which I think is the organic grassroots kind of resourcing and ideological kind of fabric of the post-coup resistance. That it's this dynamic at a local level which I think is critical to explaining the post-coup dynamic and the post-coup resistance and why it's so strong. And it's the flip side of social outsourcing, right? So You have a 1990s, 2000s, 2010s dynamic of social outsourcing, which is extremely negative in its social and economic consequence. But you also have an afterlife of that, which is now sustaining a civil society struggle against the coup and dictatorship. And
that's where it comes clean with fire, as I mentioned.
Exactly. And it makes me think back to that, old man who ran the old aged care facility during my field work, who was like, try and capture the good sides and the bad sides of this culture.
Yeah.
That there is a sense of selflessness and generosity, which is extraordinary at the micro level, and at the macro level, there are lots of people who fall between the cracks. There is the fiscal justification for austerity, where the state withdraws and just lets society fend for itself, and with all its negative kind of consequences. And the two can coexist at the same time. We need to be able to hold that greyness in order to understand the situation.
Well, thank you so much for your time today and sharing in depth about such a fascinating and important topic. The question I'd like to leave you with as we close here is, you've talked about this welfare capitalism and the way that it's transcended from NLD practice and conceptualization to the military and going back to UNU and so as we're seeing how different groups and actors have begun to reimagine a post-military Myanmar and what they could form, to what degrees do you see new ways of looking at how a state can provide services, and to what ways are you seeing kind of more of the same, kind of different innovative models, but within those models they're still kind of carrying that same ideology or methodology, that kind of this reflexive approach that the people are going to provide for themselves. That's not really the state's responsibility. So how much are you seeing that as an area of focus?
Super good question, and I think it runs to a heart of what does this revolution actually end up looking like, and I think it remains to be seen about what emerges from the ashes of this, whatever ends up unfolding. But the thing that I find remarkable is how quickly people began to question that consensus of the 2010s of what I call kind of democratic welfare capitalism. The first part of the book is sort of what I call autocratic welfare capitalism, from basically the colonial period through till the 2010s, and then democratic welfare capitalism being the sort of NLD or the Thein Sein NLD kind of period, and how democracy was sort of conceptualized and functioned. And we've seen a very rapid disavowal of this kind of idea of, crony control of vast swathes of the economy, the military's integration and control over the jade and gems industry, oil and gas. And so I think that there's this kind of discourse increasingly after the coup that was kind of existed in ethnic civil society to some degree or another. In Kachin State, there was a lot of debates about natural resource rents, tax kind of thing, and how do you ensure that resources that come from the context will actually end up benefiting people in the community. But increasingly, I think post-coup, there's been more of that. On a kind of broader ethnic Burma basis that is, I think, striking, that the critiques of the political economy of the 2010s have come about really quickly, especially about things like taxation, the military, and really moving beyond the military as an entity, which would have huge social and economic consequences. And so, I don't know, I think it remains to be seen. There's so many different forces and flows that are all combining in the current context. But I think an overarching theme that comes across if you follow resistance forces is how self-reliant oriented they all are.
Yeah.
Including those that are ostensibly linked to the NUG.
Right.
And so I think that tells you something about the political disposition of those organisations and the trajectory of, if there's a new political structure, that it's going to be very light touch, central government in all intents and purposes, and that how you fund it, how you structure it, may not even be federal. It may be more decentralised even than that, which raises questions about what it would mean to be a federation, or what it would mean to be a political community that's sort of manages to hang together in a different political structural kind of way. But it's certainly not going to be viable to try and force these kind of local kind of resistance forces to all of a sudden just put down their arms, give up their political and social influence without them being part of that process of political integration and, you know, shaping the political kind of framework. And I think you see it now to some degree or another with NUG attempts to try and bring these resistance groups under their command, or provide them with resources to support social governance. That, it's the NUG is limited in resourcing, and the result is that organisations, local resistance groups, need to be mostly self-financing, and that means that they need to, find creative ways to engage with local civilians and traders and business people, and it also means that they basically call the shots locally in a way that the NUG, they support in many cases the general and broad objectives of the NUG, but if the NUG gives them a directive that brings them into conflict with that local kind of social contract that they have with the community, or the local political economy, then that won't necessarily be followed. And so then I think there's questions about how a post kind of what a political structure might look like, but I suspect it's going to be pretty decentralised and fairly kind of localised in the way that resources are kind of raised, but also perhaps with this sense that there are some national assets that need to be shared in a way that they haven't historically been, and that the military would be a completely different entity and structure, which we could talk for hours more about demobilisation and what that process might look like, but we're so far away from imagining a post-Tatmadaw kind of military structure and political structure. But I am really heartened to see how the inequities of social and kind of natural resources and that kind of stuff have actually had a lot more scrutiny since the coup, and that the consensus that it's sort of the military and its networks will always be dominant in the economy, and we can't really demand too much. There is an opening now. This kind of revolutionary moment of defining what is possible, and who do we want to put at the centre of our political kind of struggle, and is that where do the poor, where do those who are left behind by capitalism, as it's been practiced in the Burmese context, where do they sit? Where do trade unions and labour activism kind of sit? And it is quite amazing to see that even in this kind of dictatorship context, that like trade union activists in Yangon have still been able to get quite a big recent deal on a big increase in pay and conditions. And this is a big debate amongst labour union activists who, some of whom, have felt very conflicted about how to engage with international actors who are having things made, like garment factories in Yangon. But these things are happening. You see this is debate about democracy in the workplace, even though you have autocracy in the country. And that you do see a level of involvement in politics from, trade unions and labour activists that wasn't the case, prior to the coup at the same scale. And so I think that's also heartening that there's a sort of a working class kind of mobilization which really didn't exist in the 2010s, and certainly didn't exist in the 1990s in the same kind of way of a working class that was sort of leading the vanguard. And so I think that those kinds of sociological dynamics of new groups that are quietly organizing, forming their political kind of agendas, but also trying to figure out how they improve the livelihoods of people even amidst autocracy. I think that's remarkable, and I think that it tells you something that even though the situation is incredibly complicated and violent, and economically Myanmar is gone backwards hugely in the last few years, that there is some level of political and social dynamism which is still possible, even in SAC controlled areas. And you see this after the earthquake, for example, where there's lots of organisations which have been getting funds from within Myanmar or from external partners to be able to lead the reconstruction efforts in SAC controlled kind of areas. There is a level of dynamism. There are new networks being formed and relationships being formed after things like the earthquake, connecting different groups of people, some of whom are not necessarily politically that active, but have good connections at a local level, and then resistance forces being able to coordinate to get support to urban areas, for instance, because resistance forces are largely rural kind of based. And so these kinds of new networks, new kinds of relationships that are formed through different episodes of the post-coup kind of landscape are super important, I think, for understanding what we're building on, where things are going, and the kind of ways that political power and state-society relations might be kind of structured in the future.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. And, I know that the military has never sought to win the hearts and minds of the people and go on any kind of campaign like that, but it also is somewhat, one would think that that during some part of the history that there might have that it might have made sense to someone in the military to curry favor with one type of group or area or geographic by providing those kind of services, but it just appears that the level of greed and the level of control that was being sought at that time was that I don't know of so many examples where the normal kinds of services were being provided, even to pit one group against each other by being able to give one group access to those greater goods. But as we know, the military is somewhat of its own insular institution, separated from the people, and so I suppose that that strategy never really came to light, unless there's something I'm not aware of.
Well, I mean, I think it's important to also remember that social outsourcing was something that the military helped to facilitate.
Yeah.
That it served their strategic interests because they wanted to spend more on the military, that they shifted responsibilities over to private actors and local kind of civil society, if you want to think of it and frame it in that way. And so, they made a sort of strategic decision, and it's then had the consequence now of sustaining resistance.
Right.
And so, it's sort of, there was it wasn't an enlightened decision in the sense that they believed that it would be a more effective way in which to provide social benefits. It was an abandonment of the state's kind of social responsibility in that sense. But it was, I argue in my book that there was a dynamic of, negotiation between local military commanders and business people in the 1990s, where business people were basically told, if you don't show that you're doing something in the community, whether you're building schools or something like that, then we're not going to renew you for your licenses, because licenses need to be renewed every year. And so there was a sort of a social regulation that was happening by military officials who recognised that things were very bad.
But you think they'd want to take credit for that?
Yeah, well, but this is the kind of complexity of this sort of moral economy as well, right? That they sort of co-produce this ecosystem, but part of that relied on them saying, we're going to allow business people to take goodwill, to take credit as having goodwill and having Setana for having donated to these initiatives. But in the book I go into a lot more detail about, there's the government organised NGOs, which were often in government newspapers, and there's a few folks who've done fascinating studies. There's some Burmese academics at University of Mandalay who've looked at New Light of Myanmar reporting on donation ceremonies and what they were for, and who was depicted in those photos in New Light of Myanmar during the 1990s and 2000s. So really fascinating kind of research. But often that was the government, the one or two organisations within a township that were kind of government endorsed, or semi-government endorsed NGOs. But then you had these broader community-based organisations that would spring up, with a similar kind of form and use a similar kind of discourse, but occupied by people who, might have been arrested in '88 and wanted to keep a low political profile, but also wanted to do some kind of political or activity that they thought was socially and civically kind of beneficial. And so that's where the unintended consequences, I think, begin. There's sort of this concept that, we just allow a couple of organisations to develop in each township that we think we can control. You've actually created this much larger sociology, this set of ideas, and a set of concepts and ideologies that began to encourage people to engage in social, kind of civic and kind of charitable action. And so, how do you hold the military both responsible for being simultaneously incredibly selfish, incredibly stupid, incredibly destructive, at the same time as, like a disaster. A disaster can both destroy and produce new relationships and new kind of realities. And in some ways, that's how I kind of think about the military's role, that it's kind of inadvertently created its own deepest enemy in some ways, that there's a society that is capable of pushing back and fighting back in a way that has, will continue to support and sustain resistance. And that society is not just in Myanmar now, it's increasingly abroad. There's millions of Burmese people in Thailand, millions of people internationally, and I met someone just on the train here in the Netherlands just a few days ago who, in the space of 2 or 3 minutes, told me about how he's been living abroad for the last 10, 15 years, but since the military coup, he's got a lot more politically active, and he's been sending money back to the resistance groups, and it's all within 2 or 3 minutes of just meeting this guy. You think, wow, there is a sense of Burmese struggle, which is not just when you leave the country that you give it up. There is a deep connection back to your family, to your community, and an aspiration that, enough's enough. We need to make sure that our society has something, our kids have something better to look forward to, even amongst those who are now living abroad, either for a temporary period with the hope of going back, or people who've left for a more kind of permanent kind of arrangement. But I think where does the military kind of sit in how we conceptualize social outsourcing? I think it's simultaneously that they unintended consequences, I suppose, of trying to prioritise and shift responsibilities and prioritise on military expansion has created this culture and organisational capacity to now sustain resistance that's kind of extraordinary, and also the military's sort of worst enemy. So there's a certain irony and paradox there.
That anecdote on the train, it reminds me of so many conversations I've had where it's not enough to call it survivor's guilt, that's part of it, but there's also, from so many Burmese that I've met that are in some relative place of safety. I say relative because it could be that they're in the West as the individual you've met, but I've also met people that are just not in direct harm's way in the country itself, just literally not on the front lines, and they have survivor's guilt with that. But beyond survivor's guilt, there's this sense of and it's been articulated to me in this way of like, am I doing enough for my country? Am I doing enough for my community? Am I giving enough back? Am I spending enough time? Is there more I could be doing? And sometimes this becomes an overwhelming burden where, like, if you go to the park or the beach for a day and you enjoy yourself, if you have a great pizza or ice cream, or you get to travel somewhere, you watch a movie, all these thoughts keep coming. Well, they can't watch a movie. They don't have electricity. They can't have a good meal. Sometimes they have no meal at all. I don't have people bombing me overhead. I get to be in a safe park, and all of these other questions that come, and this sense that in cumulatively, the folks I've talked to for the interviews, the sense of like, it's almost like this challenge of being able to live one's life, because as you're also progressing in your own life, there's and the path that you're on, there's this parallel reality happening in Myanmar that you're personally feeling responsible for. And I reference again this, and I say again because I've referenced it on several conversations because it struck me so much. Interview we did with a Amsterdam-based artist, JC, who's Karen. And when we were talking about her journey, she mentioned being in, after college in Bangkok. She then went back during the transition period and lived at that time, and then after the coup left again. She referenced how when I asked her about the transition period, and the coup that followed, she made the comment that the democracy was not as strong as she realized it was, and that she wished she would have known that so she could have done more. And I reflected back to her, you're a 20-something college graduate who is lamenting that you didn't do enough to restore your country's democracy. This burden was not on you. And this was the kind of, and I think it's also a powerful way to close out this conversation, because it's holding this contrast again where, and I told JC as she said this, I said, this kind of fills my heart and breaks my heart, because I don't know how many other 20-somethings would feel a personal sense of the strength of their country's democracy. And that's beautiful, but and that fills the heart, but it breaks the heart to think that you're carrying this burden, that you're thinking as a recent college graduate, what could I have done better and more to have made my democracy stronger to prevent it against a coup? It's unimaginable. But I think this does go along with this whole conversation and narrative that we've been discussing, this sense that that it is this burden they take on, and whether that's been taken on through societal conditioning, or through Buddhist frameworks, or through intentional military aims to open up civic space and encourage this, whatever confluence and cocktail of different threads that have been there, it is a sense that exists. This sense that that I have this burden and this responsibility, and along with this survivor's guilt, this kind of haunting question that plagues so many of the Burmese I know of like, am I doing enough? Is there more I should be doing? And this constant questioning, and that's a lot to carry with you.
Well, I think it's also helpful perhaps to think about everyone having a different place and role in this particular moment.
Yeah.
And that some people are able to take risks that others can't, but that, as you say, there is this general disposition to saying, how are we supporting our country, and how are we supporting our people at this particular moment? And I think of it as like a spectrum of resistance, that sort of some people at some points in time were able to take extremely risky decisions to be on the front line in very overt and ways that are putting their bodies on the line and their minds on the line, and then you have others who are able to fundraise for them, but are not on the front line, or you have sort of gradations of involvement in supporting the country outside of directly supporting resistance, and supporting organisations in a variety of ways. And I think I think of it as like this sort of sliding scale where it's very rare that I meet a Burmese person who isn't sitting somewhere on that spectrum.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that they might slide as well at different points in time. And I think the longer this situation unfolds, the capacity for people to, at one point, and you see this with like people fleeing conscription, for instance, where I've spoken to some young people who were like holding off, postponing doing their exams after the coup because they're on CDM, like their final exams to graduate. then ultimately they, basically said after 2 years, we just are going to take our exams, just get it done and leave and get out of the country, and then we can support the resistance better by being income earners abroad.
Yeah.
And just as they decided to apply to leave the country, the conscription was announced, so then they had to run away outside the country before they could go through those kind of MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, kind of partnerships with other countries in Asia to go and work as engineers or whatever, right? And so, you see this sort of gradations over time. Now they're, like there's a whole new phase of their life where they're like, we're in Thailand and we're having to figure out how we navigate this moment. Where do we study? Where do we work? How do we continue to support people, our friends, from university who are also more involved in resistance now? And so, there's this there's a relational dimension to it, but then also it's at different points in time over the, since the coup, and over time people's engagement in that resistance effort evolves. And I think that's also comes back to this bigger question about like what, that story you told of the artist who felt like I should have been doing more. It makes me think about this broader question of what Myanmar and Burmese people have to teach us.
Yes.
More broadly.
Absolutely.
And about this particular historical moment in time globally that we cannot take for granted. Our democracies, we cannot take for granted social inclusion, allowing political bullies to silence people in the most aggressive and egregious ways. The next moment they will come for you. Like it's sort of a question for all of us to say, like, we can't take our politics for granted, and we can't be complacent. And in the same way that I think Myanmar has a huge amount to teach us about resistance. Like the ways in which these complex dynamics of non-violent and violent civil disobedience and resistance have interacted in the Burmese context since the coup is well beyond where current theorising is of civil disobedience and resistance, the ways in which even people who have kept on their roles in the SAC in government whilst continuing to feed intelligence or sabotage the way in which the government is functioning. Again, this teaches us something about the nature of resistance and actually Burmese people at the forefront of trying to figure out civic struggle, political, visioning of what the future could be, and making that real. And it's constantly humbling to kind of encounter all of the creative ways in which even people who you think like have nothing to give, but they will still find something like click fighting or whatever, like where they basically click farms, play the YouTube advertising kind of incentives to feed resources back to the resistance. And so these kinds of creative mechanisms are things that I think Myanmar has a lot to teach us all about political struggle and not taking for granted the freedoms that we all have. That it's up to us all to stand up and continue to fight.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Given the importance of the topics we cover, it's my firm commitment and guarantee that our podcast feed will never sit behind a paywall, and that all of our episodes will be freely available for all to access. However, just because the episodes are free does not mean there is no cost with producing them. Truth be told, it can sometimes be a bit of a challenge to keep afloat from month to month, and sometimes our limited resources prevent us from taking on the type of content that we'd really like to pursue. So, if you found today's episode of value and would like to help us continue to produce more interviews just like this one, we would greatly appreciate a contribution. You can offer up a small recurring donation through Patreon or PayPal, or explore our other donation options by going to insightmyanmar.org/donation. We also invite you to consider stepping up your level of support by becoming a member. You can learn more about this by going to insightmyanmar.org/membership. Thank you very much for your consideration.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam